Put my little camera. Yeah.
This debate is an actors debate from the perspective of the US, specifically because only the US has the capacity to nationalize Boeing, given that Boeing is a company that exists within the United States. There are two key pieces of important context about Boeing. The first is that, well, Boeing does two things. One is that they sell commercial airplanes, the second is they also sell military airplanes. Notably, they are part of the Big Five defense that caters towards the defense needs of the United States, which means that they serve a very important defense role and they have a monopoly in terms of like producing airplanes and military aircraft for the United States. Therefore, Boeing constitutes a very important national interest towards the United States, which necessitates a need to keep it alive. The issue here is that because of the fuck-ups, because of the commercial size that's happening, it means to say that we think that a lot of the money that Boeing has is going to be siphoned off to support the commercial side, given that they have incurred a lot of debt in and of itself, which that affects their ability to produce military aircrafts for the United States, which affects their national interest in and of itself. Importantly to note, we will also suggest that because of the fact that they have lost a lot of market share to their competitors, Airbus, it means to say that even if they were to recover from the debt crisis that they currently have, the problem is that they will never be able to have the same level of market dominance that enables them to make the commercial side of their business extremely profitable as compared to last time, which means to say that that again complicates and compromises on their ability to focus on military aircrafts, something that the US desperately requires at a time of massive tensions around the world. The first argument that we're going to explain is why is it the case that the large amounts of debt and the economic problems that Boeing is facing right now is going to affect the military capabilities of the United States. The first thing I want to note is that the reason why Boeing currently has, is in a very big problem is because of the, what the Infoslide suggests, that they have a lot of problems trying to sell their airplanes because of the maintenance cost issue. But importantly, I want to note that they have a large amount of debt that they have, again because of the Infoslide, which means to say, right, which suggests two things. One is that in the event that they are unable to pay off their debt, it means to say that they have to declare things like bankruptcy, they're going to get into a lot of problems, their company have to be sold off, and that's going to mean that the United States doesn't have the ability to acquire state-of-the-art aircrafts. But the second thing I want to note is that even if they don't go to the worst case scenario where they go bankrupt, the fundamental issue is this: they have to continuously make interest payments so as to not default. And that amount of money means to say that they have to spend a lot of money trying to pay off these interest loans, which means that they don't have the money to do things like R&D for their military aircrafts, or they don't have the ability to produce more military aircrafts for the United States. But the second thing I want to note is that at the point in which they have this large amount of debt and they have to constantly pay off the interest, it means they also can't take on more loans, which means that they also have lesser capacity to invest into military aircrafts and the ability to develop the military capabilities of the United States. The end result is this: Boeing now doesn't have the capacity to produce military aircrafts for the United States. They don't have the capacity to, grow these airplanes and do things for the United States. Why then is this important and a vital interest for the United States? The first thing I want to note is that comparatively to many other countries, the US has one of the most secretive and most important, most advanced sorts of aircrafts out there. For instance, anti-radar technology that they use to produce things like the B-2 style bombers, or things like anti-air surface-to-air missiles that can cause a lot of big boom explosions that happen. These are unique technology that only exists towards the United States, specifically developed by Boeing, which means to say that Boeing is a key component in the military asset of the United States. At the point where Boeing is unable to continuously produce military aircraft or technology for the US, then the US loses a comparative advantage in the military across the world. The question now is, why can't they turn towards other military aircraft companies out there? The first thing I want to note is that Boeing has the expertise to create those advanced forms of military aircrafts, given the fact that they have many years of research and the structures to do so. But the problem right now is, again, that money is constantly being siphoned off to pay off the debt from the commercial side. The second thing I want to note is that compared to other kinds of military aircraft companies out there, Boeing is still the most advanced one. It still has the capacity to create the best forms of aircrafts out there, which means to say that it's vitally important that the US continues to keep them. Importantly, at the point where Boeing does suffer a lot and they have to sell off their companies, the point where other countries might potentially get a hold of the specs of these aircrafts that the United States has. Countries like China and Russia, they are antithetical to the interests of the United States. Sure.
So if Boeing goes bankrupt, as you say, and they are forced to liquidate, why can't we acquire it then? Why must we do it now?
This is same right. You do it now, do it later, still the same thing, right? Still nationalizing, right? Don't give me this kind of case, please. Second thing then, the second argument that I'm going to explain is why is it the case that we must nationalize it, but we can't do things like bail them out. We explain why is it the case that nationalization is vitally important. The first thing I want to note is that we think that the problems of Boeing is going to continue to occur precisely because it's a private company that cares about making profits. That means to say that they're often owned by shareholders who care about things like quarterly reports, who care about things like making profits as fast as possible so they can get their dividends and fuck off as soon as they can. The main issue with this is that it leads them to not focus on things like safety concerns or things like maintenance costs, which means to say that the reputation of Boeing is going to continuously worsen insofar as we foresee that the same maintenance issues are going to happen again precisely because of the inherent structure of the company in and of itself. Notably, they might say, but the backlash forces them to consider other considerations. But we want to note that oftentimes the aircraft, right, takes quite a while to build and the maintenance takes a long time to maintain. Which means, and often these shareholders are not in it for the long term. They're just there to earn their dividends and get out the moment they can when they've made enough money. Which means to say that oftentimes the shareholders have no incentive to care about long-term plans like the maintenance of these kinds of commercial aircraft. The second thing we want to note, right, is that even if it were the case that shareholders were benevolent and they really care about the maintenance of the aircraft and long-term plan, the fundamental problem is that the market share of Boeing has shrunk to such a large extent to a point where Airbus has now become an effective competitor against them, means to say that it's unlike the case that Boeing is able to get the same level of profit and loss in the future, insofar as they have to continuously compete against Airbus, which means to say that they just can't make as much money as they could in the future, and insofar as they can't do that, it also fundamentally means that their ability to pay off that debt becomes even lower as time goes by, which compromises again on the military aspect of the company. Which means to say that even if we were to build out Boeing, the same issues still persist, their market share still remains the same, it's still smaller than ever. The conclusion of this is that it's vitally important to nationalize Boeing insofar as we think the US government is able to do it better. Why? We think that firstly, in terms of the commercial side, they are fine with the commercial side, like not doing, like being okay, like just there, doing their own thing, or getting rid of it, paying off the debt and fucking off. But we think that the military aspect is where Boeing is vitally important to the US, insofar as Boeing is able to provide key military infrastructure to the government. Why will the US do this well? Number one, the US is a country, a lot of money, they can pool resources from many departments to fund military developments within Boeing, especially utilizing the expertise that Boeing currently already has to form better military aircraft. Secondly, we think that the United States also help to more accountability, insofar as if things go wrong, they can get elected out. They are accountable to the electorate, which means to say that the country is probably going to be more focused on long-term goals rather than short-term profit. For these reasons, propose.
Thank you for the speech.
Boeing's failures are not a coincidence, but due to a lack of incentive to actually manufacture for safety instead of profitability. And I think I can give two reasons for this. Firstly, you want to make products cheaper so that you can get more purchasers, because the cheaper your aircraft are, the more likely it is the case that other individuals are going to buy it. This is especially important for Boeing, since that you want to get out of debt as quickly as possible, because that makes you seem unreliable on what Wayne says. So because of that, they don't want to be overtaken, they want to sell as much products as possible, and thus because of that, they want to make the most amount of profit in the shortest amount of time. That's why they're willing to do things like sacrifice safety. Secondly, they also know that the government can't really do much preventive actions against them, because Wayne is right, that the US government is heavily reliant on these aircraft, and because of that they need to be able to allow Boeing to continue to exist insofar as they want to continue getting military advantages. The problem about Wayne's speech, however, is that I'm uncertain as to why it's the case, that just because a government takes over the entire Boeing system, that it leads towards any of these incentive changes. Notably here, notice that all of these problems are things that are still going to be transferred over to the government insofar as nationalization happens. You still need to get out of debt insofar as you nationalize as the government, Boeing, and stuff like that. You still have bad incentives to do things like, for example, make products for cheaper. You still, for example, need Boeing to exist, because insofar as you do things like, for example, make it less competitive because you make it safer, and thus because of that you reduce the ability for them to be able to do things like manufacture, because in the short term you have to sacrifice that in order for you to do things like, for example, make safety procedures or rebuild your factories, then it leads towards these areas then dying out. The problem about the entire case, the uncertain as to why is it the case, the government are likely to be better actors. That is how it happens. Notably here, this is not a debate about letting Boeing die or live, but much rather about how you use the limited spread of funds in order for you to be able to actually help Boeing to be able to survive. That is what the debate is. With that being said, set up before three points of this debate. Understand that we have counter PR in this motion. So what is our counter policy? Is that we are going to just basically put money and subsidies up for grabs insofar as Boeing increases its safety procedures. Well, notably here, the way which we're going to do this is that we're going to do it in increments over time with benchmarkers. So insofar as you do something like, for example, set proper safety procedures, rebuild your factories properly with these things, with the money we give you, and you are able to do things like, for example, ensure that less crashes happen with the KPI every year, then it leads towards you getting more money. This is a more direct way for you to be able to help them with their debt crisis by actively giving them money to help with their debt, much rather than putting money into a sinkhole that is nationalization. 3 points I want to talk about then. Firstly, why the state incentives after nationalization is still flawed. Secondly, the implication of this, and thirdly, why the comparative government but thirdly and most importantly, why is it the case that the comparative outside of the house is likely to be better? Before that, go ahead.
So your policy is we will bail out Boeing on the nth time, and then on the condition that they fix themselves. What's the enforcement mechanism if they choose not to?
The enforcement mechanism isn't that we do anything, because like I said, on both sides of the house, it's very hard for you to do things like, for example, enact any form of punitive action against them. Much rather, it's about which side actually incentivizes Boeing to do the best thing for the country, right? So on our side, because the incentive is that, oh, you are probably going to do things well from the basis and perspective that we are able to help you bail you out of these debts, and it happens in increments, so you can't just take the money, not do the thing, and promise us that you'll do the thing, and then not do the actual thing, which is what Boeing has been doing the entire time. So because that, the increments portion of this matters. So with that out of the way, let's talk about it then. Firstly, about why the comparative government nationalization is bad. I think I can give 3 reasons for this. Firstly, that the investment that you give under the government is just going to be too big to fail. Understand Boeing is a very big company. Buying them over is going to be very largely expensive because of the fact that you not only have to buy them over, but you also have to buy the things like, for example, the aircraft over and everything that you have in between. The problem about this is that this is money that needs to be justified to the individual on the ground as to why you spend. Governments are populist. You need to be able to cater towards the individuals on the ground and justify why is it the case that you are spending billions of dollars of a company that you perceive to be dying. Because of this, the ways in which this manifests then is that you are likely to continue bad actions or continue to be able to be unable to make big changes because you need Boeing to continue making profit in order for you to say that the nationalization was something that was worth happening. Insofar as this is true, understand that it doesn't matter what are the incentives of the government or what any side wants to say. That this is a big incentive and you have to weigh this highly because every single government needs to be populist, every single government needs voters, and that's because that insofar as you put money into a sinkhole that is not earning money, this is probably going to be more unpopular with the individuals on the ground. Secondly, that spending all your money to buy Boeing and pay out of the debt is just super costly and this money taken away from innovating. Notably here, understand that what Wayne talks about investors and all of these things being individuals to want profit are also the reasons why it's the case that insofar as you're able to get the best case, which you're able to pay off all their debts, nationalize and do safety and do things for safety, that you have less individuals that are willing to invest in you and you get more individuals pulling out. This is because oftentimes this leads towards there being less money being in the pool. Because oftentimes safety means that you have to sacrifice things like short-term profitability. Because you have to do things like, for example, again, rebuild your factories. You do things like, for example, make new standardization of safety practices that leads towards you not being able to do things like mass produce. This oftentimes means that investors on the ground that are short-term, like what Wayne says, oftentimes pump less capital into these areas. So even if you are able to actually go ahead and like bail them out and get them out of all these problems, and you're able to get better incentives, the problem is that you get less incentives for your investors to actually continue investing and you get less innovation. This is particularly bad because Wayne's win con is just proving to you why is it the case that it's better for the US insofar as you get more innovation. I prove to you why is it the case that you are unlikely to get new innovation insofar as you pull this out. The implications of this is simple. We can accept everything that OGs is saying, which is that yes, it is the case that this is important for innovation, but they get less innovation on their side insofar as the money that is getting pumped in doing A isn't directly going to newer innovations in any better way, but B, most importantly, that you lose money from investors not being willing to buy things from you. So why is the comparative outside better insofar as states incentivize these individuals to do these things well? I think I have 3 reasons under this. Firstly, that you give them a direct problem solution. That you give them a way out of debt that doesn't actually cost them anything much more. So basically, because of this, they're likely to do these things well because they know that these things A are able to help them in the long term because you're able to refix your reputation for all of the safety problems they talked about earlier. But B, and most importantly, this is something that doesn't take away any form of risk or any form of problems that they they have, because you're directly helping them to increase their manufacturing power, you're directly helping them to increase, for example, the ability for them to create better aircraft, and just because that you're helping them dominate the market way more. So they're likely to actually follow these things and help you, especially since that the government is a much more steady stream of fund in comparison to investors who are oftentimes more frail. Secondly, that you have an increased capacity to do that, because you no longer have to buy them and move them out of debt. With that being said, you can use the leftover subsidies to do things like, for example, personally invest into more innovation. You're going to give them more access money for them to be able to do things like, for example, innovate better aircraft. You're allowed to help them to, for example, innovate better missiles, because you give them more subsidies than they actually need. We're allowed for them to innovate more. So you have more money left over in the pool because you don't have to nationalize just to push them out there. That allows for you to be able to create more innovation. But thirdly, you also get more investor confidence. The government backings means that there is additional money in the pool, and oftentimes investors want to take this up for grab. So insofar as they know that the government is actively helping you out, insofar as they know that the government is pumping money in there, they want to get a piece of that pie, because they know that insofar as they invest, the government is going to help them out. Overall, we give a much more plausible solution as to how you can move them out of there. For all those reasons, propose.
Yep.
So the push coming out from OO seems to be that in order to nationalize, we'll take on so much debt that then the operation itself is unattainable, which means that our capacity to turn Boeing around is going to be difficult. I'm not exactly sure what exactly is the mechanism here. I will refute the overall premise that it's very expensive to acquire Boeing in the first place. My first response is that I think the US as an entire country has access to cheap capital. So insofar as you can back those capital with the fact that you are a broadly diversified economy, it's likely then you can get a loan at a cheap interest rate. The second and more important one is, I think there's an easy angle here for a nationalist electoral angle. So their argument seems to be that people will just be very unhappy because a lot of money is being spent. I think it might be true anywhere else in the world, where we're talking about the US of A, where people are naturally, just broadly supportive of one of the biggest military industrial complex in the world. The capacity for you to say that you need to acquire this for the interest of national defense is something that is extremely popular, which means that people will not give you pressure. In fact, on the flip side, it's going to be very easy for you to raise government bonds in order to finance this. The third and last reason is, in the end of the day, Boeing is still a very profitable company, has capacity to turn around, which means that if it's the case that we're able to achieve profitability at the end of the day, we can slowly pay back those loans. So, maybe we won't be able to pay it back right away, but at least the interest rate will be covered by our profit, and in the long term, we'll eventually be able to pay back. If all this analysis is true, then I don't think it's true that then we have financial duress. And what that means is our capacity to regulate and turn Boeing around is quite high. On the flip side now, I want to compare why it's the case that these things are all better ways to turn Boeing around as compared to the mechanism of subsidies. The first reason is, I'm actually not very sure why is it the case that the executives running these companies are going to try their best to capture the subsidies in the first place. And the reason for that is because Wayne has already established why these people are short-termists. If it's the case that they want to get as much money as possible, they want to clear a KPI in the short term, and that is the kind of motivation that makes it so that people, internally they created a rotten circle that cut back on inspections and cutting corners in order to make it so that the country that company goes badly anyway. So maybe it's the case that your top executive might give the direction that they might want subsidies, but if it's the case that people in between are people that you do not staff there because they're not government employees, they're still operating based on KPIs, then it's likely to be the case that they would prioritize producing aircraft more often, more rigorously, giving price discounts at the expense of safety. So even if the incentive of a subsidy exists, it does not prove why it's the case that at each and every level within the business, these people prioritize capturing those subsidies as opposed to doing things well. The second reason is maybe it's the case that they do it in the short term because the subsidy is important for Boeing to get through this period of financial crisis, but it's not clear why it's the case that it's to be so in the long term. The problem that Wayne posited to you is structural in nature. Like they've already captured a sizable degree of market share. Like they are complacent, and the structure within it is deeply capitalistic. So maybe the subsidy works in the short term, but in the long term, if this profit incentive remains, then it's likely to be the case that they will default back to these behaviors again. If that is true, then now all the money you've sunk into subsidies is now just wasted. On the comparative, I think it's just cheaper to buy up the company, replace leadership at the individual level, combine them with the rest of the talent pool that you have in the civil service in order to turn this company around. I think in the long run, that's a cheaper mechanism. I also lastly want to weigh up the capacity of accountability. And the reason for that is because it's not just the case that you can give subsidies and then you don't monitor. So the capacity for you to regulate these agencies is heavily involved within like your individual enforcement like agencies. Right? So for example, I don't know, like the NEA for the environment. So like for aviation, there's a FAA, I suppose. These agencies are not the most well-funded, and therefore when you use them as an intermediary, your capacity to enforce regulation is weak. I think on the comparative, when you own the company, the degree of accountability that you have to take is drastically different. The first reason is just simply, god damn it, like you own the thing, right? So it's the case that the planes go kaboom, like people blame the government as opposed to the FAA or the company itself and blame capitalism. The second reason is just that, well, like, yeah, each and every, so like, you have already gone through this process of nationalization, like all of the, basically it goes back to the reason that you own this, and it's not dependent on you being able to cut corners with the agency. If it's the case that, so at the moment, if it's the case that the agency is weaker, the capacity to enforce is weaker, and people don't blame the government directly, on the comparative, it doesn't matter what's the agency, people just blame the government because they run the company, and therefore, the government has to be a lot more accountable. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from opening for clarification. Okay, sure. So,
how much do you actually going for?
man, that's a. Do you have another POI? Sure. Okay. I'm not going to answer that because I don't know how. I don't think that's very relevant to the debate. I think it should, like the point is just that we can afford this. What I want to talk about now is the best case, worst case comparative. So it's clear now that in the best case, on most of the house, we want to turn Boeing around. The problem is that on that side of the house, they cannot change the profit incentive that cripples Boeing. On our side of the house, we think that it's the profit incentive that cripples Boeing from being able to access all of its comparative advantage in the first place. The fact that it already has economies of scale, the fact that it has reputation, the fact that it already has captured market share. So like for example, if the airlines buy from you, they have integrated their aircraft fleet in accordance to your like technology and the way in which your aircraft moves. The linchpin then is really just the fact that people don't trust Boeing anymore. So it's the case that we can swap that out because as a government, we have more credibility, and we can swap out people at the individual level. It's extremely likely to be the case that Boeing becomes a successful company that then benefits the United States. But in the worst case scenario, we're talking about the issue of national defense, and it's something that's just unresponded to completely. So Lit Wen has the argument that, well, if it's the case that you want it eventually, you can wait until it fails and then buy it up. But the problem is, in the interim, we're losing out on that competitive edge. So it's not just the US that's innovating in aircraft carriers. Like China is very willing to invest drastic amount of money in order to be able to do all these things. And the capacity for us to not be able to like continue with that process is problematic. It's also not about whether Boeing rescue itself eventually or not. It's about how quickly can it do so. Because Wayne has already told you about the case of the interim, where in order to keep itself alive, what Boeing does is that it either siphons off money from the military complex and move it into the commercial complex to keep that operation alive because that operation is just wider. But what that means is that the money is being siphoned away from R&D. Money is being siphoned away from innovation. But the tipping point of innovation happens when you're at the forefront of innovation, which is where we are now, which is why we can conduct, for example, like insurgent military campaigns and bombings in other territories without the other governments even knowing so. The fact that we lose these things because another government can catch up in terms of developing a better stealth bomber, or another government being able to develop like radar technology to detect our bombers, all things that cripple that massive amount of investment in the first place, that cripples the capacity, that cripples the fact that we held that advantage in the first place. Acquiring Boeing gives us multiple ways in which you can go about it. If it's the case that it's ideal, we can turn both sectors around, and then we have the commercial sector empowering the amount of money that goes into R&D. Money that currently is being like diverted out to the executive in terms of dividends and pay packages that lead them astray because then it creates short-termist agendas. But in the medium term, if it's the case that we have to slowly downscale the commercial side in order to fund the continued development of the military side, then I think that's also a necessary and direct benefit to what we can do for the United States.
Denver.
opening's debate was really about one thing, right? Which is how do we fix Boeing as a company to make them stop producing lousy planes, right? So I think what I'll do first is basically break that deadlock and show conclusively in closing graph why we do this better and why nationalization better alternative. Secondly, I'm going to talk about something that opening didn't really analyze, right? Which is a non-profit motive related public goods as well as political economy benefits that cannot simply be priced into a profit motive that Boeing can use as a private firm, right? And that's going to be our unique extension. So let's have that later. So firstly, why nationalization achieves the goal of opposition better than what he mentioned. I think firstly, the model that opposition puts forth is as follows, right? We'll have results-based funding, where subsidies are tied to specific milestones or specific quality assurances or quality control measures that have been implemented for the company. We don't think this is fundamentally mutually exclusive with what nationalized firms can do. So I think I can give you like two examples, right? One is Japan Rail and Tokyo Metro. I think these are nationalized metro systems where the government also provides results-based funding for a lot of what they're doing, right? Similarly, this happens in a lot of other major transport industries as well, for instance, like shipping. So we don't really see what is necessarily something that is mutually exclusive. Next, they mentioned that there are 3 reasons why governments are not able to do so. Firstly, because governments lack knowledge. Secondly, because the funding is more diversified and therefore de-risked when it comes to the private market. And thirdly, because the government's money can be used better in other ways. So let's address these 3 things systematically, right? Firstly, the government has no skills to actually monitor these companies. We say that they can just hire the people in the private sector and then they will have the skills to, manage these companies. We don't really see what the problem here is. Secondly, in terms of funding diversification, I think the main thing that we're looking at here is that while Boeing has debt, right? The reality of the situation is that capital-intensive industries will always have debt because they have to buy a ton of equipment and they have to sell a ton of planes and keep a ton of inventories. What really matters is how much is their supernormal profits and can these profits outpace the debts that they're incurring? And the bottom line is for Boeing, they're still doing pretty good, right? If you look at the stock market right now, they're up quite a lot at this point in time. So we don't think that this necessarily means therefore that the funding diversification is necessary in order to solve the problem in the current situation, and that necessarily this de-risking is relevant in this debate to begin with. But secondly, it also means that there isn't necessarily a need for this bill to solve the problem that we're looking at today as well. Lastly, they mentioned that, and this also addresses the third point they have, right, which is whether the US has enough money to do this. Yes, they do, because it's supernormal. We in fact say the opposite is going to happen. It's going to be the cash cow for the US economy. Okay, so that's the opening opposition case dealt with. I'm now going to differentiate ourselves from opening government with my 2 extensions, right? But before that, any QIs from Hotbench? No? Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 things. Both of them tied to this key characterization, right? Which is that the key difference between a privatized firm and a nationalized firm is that at the end of the day, the shareholders in a privatized firm are the ones deciding who is going to be the CEO and who is going to be the C-suite of the companies. They're the one who's going to vote on, for instance, what the company does with its decisions in future. And if that means cutting money or if that means kicking people out for a massive cash grab, that's what the company is going to have to end up doing as long as it remains privatized. The comparative difference here, therefore, is that making something privatized ultimately makes it hostage to the profit motive of shareholders as well as consumers in the market. We posit that there are 2 key reasons why this is something that is not inherently in America's interest currently. Firstly, because the key value of Boeing, which I think opening kind of alluded to, I will actually explain properly in our case, is the public goods that it provides to American society. 2 layers of analysis here, right? Firstly, the key public goods it provides is through improving the economies of scales of secondary, tertiary, and quaternary industries in America that depends on the technological innovations that Boeing brings to the market, right? So in this case, the key value of Boeing isn't necessarily the planes that they're selling, but it's the fact that it attracts talents and creates a space where R&D can trickle down to other aerospace and aeronautical industries in America. And this is a public good that simply cannot be priced in the market because it is not inherently profitable for them to do this. So we argue that by changing the incentive structure from a profit structure towards one that maximizes the economies of scale and the productivity of the American economy, this therefore has knock-on benefits on many of the industries in the United States, right? But secondly, we argue at the same time that in many cases, so in many cases, the second thing is that a lot of these benefits are also not excludable, right? So we think that because of these, when you nationalize Boeing, the key impact is that a lot of these benefits will be realized, which simply cannot be realized in a privatized structure of the company. The second thing I'm going to look at is how, in many cases, these things, the key interests that Boeing can forward are also interests that are inherently not profitable. Because when we're talking about political economy here, we are trading economic profits for political value. And when you look at Boeing as a strategic national asset, the importance of this is something that doesn't get placed into the price mechanism, right? Because when you convert economic surplus into political surplus, that's inherently unprofitable. But what is the political surplus that can be priced in when we nationalize Boeing? A couple of areas, right? Firstly, we think that commercial air travel is a strategic industry for the United States. Being able to supply planes to every single country out there gives America massive soft power over these countries. Being able to deny countries like China the ability to buy planes also gives America massive leverage over how industrial and international trade occurs on a global scale. And we say that all these decisions are inherently unprofitable. In a privatized market, this will likely never happen because of how strong the lobbies are. No thank you, sir. But in a nationalized market, we argue then that incentives exist for America to forward its political interests while trading off economic interests against something that shareholders will never do. Secondly, we argue that this also applies to the sphere of diplomacy, right? Not just economics. In many cases, when you put companies in charge of these things, these companies can override the government. So one example will be NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA circumvents the government because they can do so, right? It's more profitable to produce in Taiwan. Therefore, I will shift all my industries out of Taiwan. If you look at Trump's current American policy, he is putting in place a system of protectionism in order to bring labor and industry back into America. And we argue that it is principally consistent then for them to then nationalize Boeing. Because that, yes sir?
So clearly the US has other ways to exert soft power, and clearly you can also restrict the supply of planes to China if you think it's militarily unstrategic.
Yeah, so our response to that is, why arbitrarily remove one level when you can have it, right? Like, we don't get what the trade-off is based on their response. I hope the final rally would sort that out. But anyways, so we argue that on a diplomatic scale, this allows the United States to actually create and exert this pressure on other countries in a far more effective way. So what have I shown you so far today, right? One, we have shown you that, firstly, we've established what the structural difference is that leads to this difference in outcomes that opening government fails to do. And secondly, we have told you how we can achieve opening opposition's objectives in a more robust manner than opening opposition. Go with closing government.
I will run three extensions. The first is that Boeing is already doing well and it can recover. The second is that you create a moral hazard for defense companies to act in ways that are just bad. And the third is just that you incur a very high opportunity cost. And I will note that the opportunity cost argument is different from OO with the complete argument because they just stop at saying that like there is an opportunity cost, and I'll explain the effects of it. The first one, why is it that Boeing can recover? A few things I want to note. The first is just that the issues that occurred with Boeing were just generally short-termist and unprecedented. Like, this looked like, firstly, COVID, which happened to impact a significant part of the airline industry. This meant that just airplane sales went down. The second is just that this was a software bug, so this wasn't a hardware issue. This was an issue that can be resolved remotely, and there have been attempts to solve it. This meant that like, the last high-profile crash that Boeing experienced happened a few years ago. This means that it's not that bad of a reputational risk, or at least the current risk that it undertook was one that was very short-termist. The third is just that, like, it's also just because of terrorists that had made Boeing shares go down significantly. It's just that like the current status quo in the US is just that currently in a lot of them. Therefore, it means that like because of the kind of terrorists that were implemented, it means that like they are just struggling to sell airplanes because of terrorist stuff. But the fourth reason is also like why is it that Boeing will probably recover in the future? The first thing I want to know is just that like you can also like there is currently demand for Boeing airplanes anyways. Firstly, Europe is likely to buy Boeing planes. This looks like how, firstly, they already have high amounts of remilitarization in Europe, therefore they're probably going to buy military aircraft anyways. Second is also just that they already have existing commitments to Ukraine. And the third reason is also just that if it's true that OG sets up that like the Boeing aeroplane got very sexy technology, right? Then it's probably also true that Europe also wants a sexy technology. So there's probably going to be competing demand for like Boeing to survive under its military complex anyways. The second question is, why is it that, no thank you, why is it that Europe is unlikely? I'm not sure why is it that like the planes are exclusively being sold to the US. I think it's true that Europe will probably have a demand for like the technology anyways, therefore they're going to buy it anyways. The last reason is just that investors are currently catching on to the opportunity to potentially revitalize Boeing because they recognize that these are short-termist issues. Now I want to just like slightly respond to the kind of things that OG mentioned, right? The first is on like there is existing backlash that like the investors don't really care about the long-term plans. I think the first response is that if you only cared about the long-term plans, then you probably if you only cared about short-term benefits, like you probably wouldn't invest in an airline because of the kind of scales of like which you need to like gain some sort of money, right? Like it's a plane take to manufacture, and at the end of the day, it's just very difficult for you to like earn money in the short term. Then you probably won't invest in Boeing anyways. This means that the kinds of investors that were investing in Boeing are probably ones that go to your long term anyways. The second thing I also want to point out, right, is that it's probably not true that the market is like that kind of market share is that small, right? I want to note here is just that this market structure of like the airplane industry is one that's oligopolistic in nature. The market share is still pretty big, right? Even if it's small, right? That's still a very, very significant amount of money, and that's still something that like Boeing can still capitalize on, and investors can still like to care about. At the end of this, I've proven that Boeing probably can still recover, and the kind of issues that Boeing is facing is one that's short term and they will likely bounce back in the future. The second thing I want to point out is just that that there is currently a very significant moral hazard that's created. If the piece of framing that I want to add on here is that almost right pointing out that the US is currently in a lot of debt, this also means it's very difficult for them to undertake additional like costs. The problem here is just that the moral hazard created means that like you will have like by bailing out defense companies, what's likely to happen is just that other defense companies are more likely to want to act in ways that are more risk-taking, right? This looks like how they're more likely to undertake like very risky behaviors by embarking and spending a lot of money and investing in a lot of very uncertain tech. This looks like how they're less likely to cut down the structural inefficiencies because of the fact that they know that the government will build them out. Why is this particularly harmful, and why is it that we need to focus on particularly militaristic technology? The first is just that the military complex is just damn expensive. Like the kinds of R&D and technology that you're going to invest in, it's just a lot of money, and that amount of money, right, can probably incur quite a bit of opportunity cost, which I'll explain later. But notably, I also want to note here that the problem is just that there is very little checks and balances when it comes to like military industries. It looks like just the fact that like there is very little awareness of like what exactly goes on in military complexes. This looks like just a lot of secrecy because it's under state like protection. But secondly, it's also just because like the military industry is one that's generally very celebrated by the US, right? The people are so supportive towards it, that means they're likely to fund literally any kind of efforts towards the military industry. And this is particularly harmful because ultimately this incurs quite a high opportunity cost on the people, right? When you firstly like lose a lot of money when it comes to like the military, like you lose a lot of money because you are pumping money into like defense companies that currently act in the ways that are very morally irresponsible, where they currently overspend and take a lot of risky behaviors and undertake more debt. This means that this is just very, very bad for military companies when they don't have the risk of failure. The next thing I want to point out is why is it that there's an opportunity cost, right? Why exactly is this opportunity cost so particularly important for the US? The first frame is just that the US is already in debt, but the second thing is also just that the US currently has really bad welfare. Currently not enough money is being spent towards things like schools and hospitals and welfare. Those things are particularly important. This directly counters the CG framing on like how is it that you best create public good, right? Public good can be created through other means. That it probably looks like things like building hospitals and building schools, like serving people like the disenfranchised. But I want to note here, right, that the kind of public good that we get on outside is also compounded insofar as to reduce the kind of moral hazards onto the defense companies, right? What this looks like is just that oftentimes we flip the public good argument because it's just generally larger scale, because you ultimately attack you prevent the big five of defense from engaging in this generally very morally risky behaviors. This means that and I also want to respond to the idea that they have quite a bit of soft power diplomacy. It's also true that on their side of the house, they also then incur greater costs to soft power diplomacy on their side. So therefore, at least on our side of the house, we at least reduce the extent of harm on things like soft power diplomacy by ensuring that those companies don't undertake those risks.
But nationalization is not a bailout. Like if you run a company to the ground to the extent in which the government has to buy it out, that's a very bad reputation. Shareholders don't want to lose their shares to the government.
Sorry, again?
But nationalization is not the same thing as a bailout. I think most people do not want the government to take over the business, so this is hardly a moral hazard.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to answer that, so you won't answer it. Okay, so the next few points, so just a couple of points of debate. The first is just that we better win on the certainty of harm, right? We carry that the harms of losing a lot of money to the industrial complex in general because of the moral hazard is pretty big. And we think that the military industry is probably going to act in that way because of the kinds of certainty that the government has on the signaling effect, right? But the second thing is also just on the amounts of opportunity cost. I want to note here that Boeing is also just damn expensive, and the kind of money that the government is going to be spending is huge, right? But the problem here is just that this kind of money can be invested in a much more efficient way when you invest it within state welfare, right? And this is problematic because firstly, the US is already in debt and is already facing quite a bit of terror, so there's quite a bit of monetary shortage. But secondly, right, the kinds of government bonds that are going to be imposing on their side of the house is one that's in order to fund the nationalization of Boeing is going to be worse off because actively stifling away the welfare of the individuals on the ground.
Oh, it's fine. It's power cable for just a guess. Okay. I'll do with OO first, and then I'll deal with closing off. Then after that, I'll do some differentiation, because then I'll put what David has said in context of the debate. The first thing I want to talk about is what happened in status quo. So the 73 MAX basically had crashes because of training standards not being upheld. It was also because of maintenance standards being upheld. It is not because there's no innovation. So the important thing to note here is that the biggest benefit that you've seen the op bench try to defend is the idea that innovation is the one big thing that they will be able to get, which will somehow improve the safety of airlines. The question is, does innovation necessarily do that? Because it involves a level of risk-taking that would otherwise be something that you would not necessarily do. And I think the key thing to note here is their claim was the nationalization model doesn't create the incentives required to ensure compliance, but don't do the symmetric burden equivalent for their side. Like, why does subsidies and all of those things necessarily incentivize the same compliance anyway? So it's unclear as to how this op bench has necessarily proven their basic burden, and their big burden that they've tried to prove on innovation doesn't actually help them solve the very problem that they set out to solve. Meaning to say, what they're saying is we're not going to solve the problem at the end of the day, we're going to spend money subsidizing the innovation that will then result in perhaps some productivity increases that will go into the pockets of shareholders eventually in the form of dividends coming from the profits that Boeing raises over time. So I don't really know if this op bench can come above the entire gut bench in this round. The second thing I want to note is that this claim that people will pressure governments into funding even less on our side of the house in the nationalization model means that it will be a terrible nationalization model. One, ignores fiat that exists. Two, but more importantly, if it is true, then equally it's problematic on their side, because people don't want to subsidize these companies that got massive bailouts during the great financial crisis and also during the pandemic. What do you think happened to Boeing? They needed a bailout in those particular instances, right? So we would suggest to you that if anything, their side, there's no ability to guarantee the improvements will actually work. Subsidies for improvements was never really described. Improve what? Your training standards, your compliance standards, your auditing standards. No mechanization whatsoever from this side of the house as to what those particular training standards would be doing in terms of creating or inducing changes for safety compliance. For example, Boeing refused to send out the actual announcement to all airlines in the world saying that their pilots needed to be retrained because of a software update in the 737 MAX. In that particular instance, that's one of the reasons why the plane literally fell out of the sky and nosedived, because when it was climbing at a certain altitude, it required the pilot to actually be paying attention in that particular circumstance. In that particular instance, how do you incentivize people on their side of the house to change the training standards on their side of the house? Because Boeing has an asymmetry of information. They know software updates. They know what software updates they're going to be rolling out, right? And they are not going to have a corresponding pressure to actually show that this is something that needs to happen, that retraining needs to happen, or recall needs to happen. On our side of the house, if it's already clear that there is a software update and you're not beholden to the shareholders' desire to have supernormal profits that increase year on year, you're more likely to, for example, actually do the disclosure of the software update and also for a safe measure, get people to retrain, get pilots to retrain on our side of the house compared to their side of the house. Because that would, yes, involve us having to top the L and top the losses there, but the difference is that on our side of the house, we actually have the better safety standards that come in the comparative, and plane doors don't literally detach. So maintenance standards or building standards, like the plane door falling off, don't come because you subsidize more improvements to engineering, right? That doesn't necessarily change. On our side of the house, the difference is you get accountability at a much earlier level. The first reason for that is because of the corporate structure that basically is discussed, because we've overcome the problems that are associated with the corporate structure that David tells you about. So think about it. public ownership models are like this. The Congress nominates a few people and the Senate has confirmation hearings, because this is a public interest thing, because you are providing a public good. On our side of the house, you can start the investigations and the scrutiny of the CEO and the director and their relationships and all of those things before appointment. On the other side of the house, you want to incentivize compliance from these CEOs and all those people when they are elected by shareholders in a closed door back room. How does that necessarily occur? You don't get a clear scrutiny of those leaders' incentives or directors' incentives and executives. So all of that means, on the other side of the house, you spend taxpayer money on countless lawsuits to force Boeing to do disclosures of evidence and disclosure of information. You don't get that same problem on our side of the house in a world where the nationalization model means to say that there are no shareholders that can vote to suppress the disclosure of the information. On our side of the house, the real delta here is that you actually increase the likelihood and the propensity of disclosing information so that just access to justice and the administration of justice is far more likely to be efficient. By the way, all without spending a taxpayer dime in the way that they would have to in order for them to get the lawyers to go and fight Boeing's lawyers. All of those things are problems that are unique and asymmetric in this debate, and it comes only because of the opposition's policy of privatization. More importantly, if subsidies are a bailout for their debt, let's be very clear. China is a massive risk to the US national security issue. They are the biggest bond holders of government US public debt, meaning to say if they choose to sell US treasury bills, then the US is fucked. If you don't increase revenue streams by doing things like increasing tariffs, or in this case, like nationalizing this particular institution and actually capitalizing on its earning potential, you're not going to be in a better position in terms of national security to actually do anything meaningful to protect your defense. And that is the reason why this response also comes above the opening government's constructive material. Because what I think OG doesn't do enough of is explain the military or national security implications. What I've done here is tell you why this particular response is actually something that places us over the OG in terms of discharging their own burden of explaining why this is good for national security. So, lastly, what does CEO then say? CEO says things that are quite derivative. But more importantly, what I will point out is, one, Europe clearly won't necessarily always buy your planes because they have Airbus. You know who owns the Airbus? The French. Yeah, so obviously that's a big thing that you should probably have known. The second thing we will point out is that this moral hazard argument goes nowhere. Literally, nationalization is a way for us to deter other companies so that we don't actually reward the risk-taking nonsense of cutting corners on training and standards like that. Rewarding risk-taking happens only on their side when they are giving out all these tax breaks and subsidies to Boeing. By the way, Boeing has taken a huge, massive tax breaks forever, by the way. So that's really the world in which you have a moral hazard. The moral hazard comes from you crossing your fingers and hoping and praying that Boeing actually does something good for people. For these reasons, we propose.
Okay, Albert.
Okay, start lah. Yeah. Two questions. How is Boeing doing right now? What happens in the US in the future? Firstly, how is Boeing doing right now? This is the clash that wins us the debate. I want to know the state of the debate right now. Government bench never give you a concrete reason for why it is necessary for you to nationalize. All they do is assert that Boeing is doing badly, but this is immediately contradicted down the bench when they say that Boeing has massive amounts of market share. They say that Boeing is doing well on the stock market. All of these things point to Boeing doing well, which explains why there is no impetus for you to nationalize in the first place. Let's look at opening government. Your first claim is that Boeing is struggling and that you need to preserve, you need to buy it in order to preserve military superiority. Their first mechanism is that there's a large debt which chains them down with interest payments, which means that you cannot make more loans. First, this is in tension with their claim that Boeing has a monopoly over the advanced weapons industry, because that suggests that they are doing fine. The defense industry is booming right now. EU has committed to spend 5% of their GDP on remilitarization. There's a fear of US abandonment, and the EU is committed to Ukraine, which requires them to spend $90 to $100 billion to rearm Ukraine to fend off Russian advancement into the future, which explains why it's the case that you will continue to buy not from the commercial arm but from the military arm of Boeing. The claim from OG is that you will cross-subsidize from the military arm to the commercial arm. We say that's perfectly fine because the military arm will continue to do well into the future insofar as you need to have continued contracts into the you need to commit continued contracts in order to ensure predictability in your defense. Closing government says that the EU has Airbus. That is true, but they cannot knife their opening because Wayne points out that Boeing has a monopoly over things like radar sensor technology and surface air missiles for some reason. So if that is true, which they have to admit that is true, then it explains why you must continue to buy from Boeing. That's what opening government says. The second mechanism they have is that there's an issue of trust. First, this is not a structural issue of trust. The two crashes that happened were as a result of software autopilot that pushed the nose of the plane down. So software patches were rolled out subsequently, and the last crash happened years ago, which suggests that this issue is not one that plagues Boeing in the status quo. But secondly, I would note that the rest of the mechanisms that they provide here are uncomparative. They say that there is economies of scale. They say that their market share has been captured and there's been integration of aircraft fleets to the company. If that is true, that explains why there's a high barrier to exit, which explains why there's no capacity for companies to exit and leave Boeing as a supplier, which means that Boeing should be doing fine based on that analysis. Their third mechanism is that there's a profit incentive that is bad because the investors care about getting dividends and getting out. Flip this mechanism, most investors in Boeing are actively institutional investors with long-term interests like pension funds and university endowments. The reason why that's the case is because Boeing is a manufacturing firm. It is a firm that produces stable profits over a long period of time because of the mechanisms pointed out by opening government, which is that they have a captured market and they are one of the sole suppliers of planes within the world, which explains why these investors actually have long-term instead of short-term incentives, which beats all of opening government, because that explains why these investors have incentives to comply with regulations in order to get subsidies or to care about things like safety and regulation, why they will elect good shareholders. So we co-opt most of the benefits that opening government says, and we also unlock the benefits from opening opposition, which is to explain why you would comply with these regulations in order to get these subsidies in the first place. The final claim here that they say is that the government is more accountable, but I will note that this is not true because the value of the vote is diluted in the US. There's things like the electoral college, which means that deeply blue and deeply red zones don't actively have accountability, and also most voters are single issue voters. It's highly unclear why they would vote on the basis of Boeing rather than things like the economy or things like culture wars, so this mechanism is unclear. I'll take opening.
So it's hard for Boeing to recover from the reputation hit they took when whistleblowers exposed how executives cut corner on extraction for profits. Nationalization fixes this. How does Boeing recover organically on your side?
So you would fire those individuals because they've got massive reputational risk outside the house, which deters moral hazard and not promotes it, which is your claim, because I'll deal with that later on. I have two higher level responses here. The first thing they say is that this takes a lot of money. The first thing here is that this will take a lot of money. Tan says that the US has the access to very cheap capital, but this is not true. Because in order for you to earn this money, you will need to issue new government bonds. But the problem is that the US and the status of the US dollars and the status of US Treasury bonds has slid under Trump. The US dollar is down 9% this year, which means that bond yields are high, which crowds out investment within the economy in the macroeconomic level, but also explains why you have less money as a whole. Now I want to compare this to the mechanisms that we provide at Cadence. We explain that the problems plaguing Boeing are something that are short-termist and something that can be overcame. It is something that being hit by COVID, which means that we are able to recover 5 years after the pandemic, is the shock from tariffs that was temporary, but Boeing has now secured new abilities to access supply chains that are outside of these tariffs, which means that you're able to recover your economic potential. Insofar as it was things like corrupt executives, these shareholders that are concerned with the reputation would therefore lobby for these executives to be fired, which fixes all of these problems and explains why Boeing is strong, winning us the debate outright. I want to weigh explicitly against opening opposition because their claim is that subsidies will fix the company. This may be true. They do not give you a mechanism for why it's true. What we do in closing is we take a higher burden. We explain you don't even need subsidies to fix the company. The company will recover on your own, and therefore the investment. Second question, what happens in the US? Let's first deal with the claim from opening. Actually, let's deal with the claims from closing government first. Their first claim here is that this is good for the US because it contributes to public goods. Flip this claim. We explained under Cadence why it's the case that spending a huge amount of money would be bad for the US economy, which desperately needs the ability to spend on things like welfare. That's for a few reasons. Firstly, it's because buying Boeing would mean that you have to buy assets, buy the factories, buy all the intellectual property. That would be a lot of money. But you also need to take on the debt from Boeing, which is a lot of money. Notably, Republicans actively use things like the debt ceiling and the high amount of US government debt in order to justify not spending on things that are pro-social, so things like welfare. So on the clash of welfare, you should believe that this happens better under our side of the house. But secondly, I would note that things like benefits like transparency and benefits like being able to care about economies of scale would likely exist under both sides of the house, insofar as your reputation is an important factor in how much other companies are likely to buy your product. The second claim that comes out from them is that this is good for the political economy. There are three responses. The first is that there are other ways for you to enact political economy. The second thing is that this is uncomparative. For example, NVIDIA was forced to develop the H20 chip in order to bypass the restrictions from the US, which explains why the US has significant leverage over its domestic companies, which explains why this is not mutually exclusive. But lastly, I would note that you just have the domestic ability to do these things. Lastly, let's engage on the clash of military superiority from opening government. Their claim is that you need to be able to maintain your ability to produce militarily in order to stay ahead from the EU and China. First, these countries are nowhere close to the US. The US is the largest supplier of arms around the world for a good reason. But secondly, we flip this when we explain why this creates a moral hazard. Tan's response is that this is bad for your reputation. But their model is that they would keep these individuals around anyways because they have proprietary information, because they have trade secrets and they have leadership experience. So you want to preserve that experience when you nationalize, which explains why this incentive doesn't materialize.
Alright, thanks for the round. Shake hands and please speak to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take 2 minutes.